Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We have successfully done a tech handover and we now have Alex Morse with us. So Alex is an independent ecologist, freelance journalist, educator and author. And if you're involved in Bristol's parks and wildlife, chances are you've seen her face before. So we've briefed Alex today to talk about the importance of getting to know what nature is in your park already before you decide what it is you want to do to enhance it or make improvements. She's going to explore how to monitor what's changing and, yes, how to make the best decisions about what habitats you can enhance to support nature in your park. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Alex.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I hope everyone can see me all right and everything. I'm quite new at this stuff, so let me know in the chat box if things go wrong, please. I'll just start talking. So thank you for having me here today. I have worked with parks and communities over a few years to make an effort to try to bring back nature to cities, but also to try to bring people closer to it. So today I'm going to give you an overview of how we bring back more wildlife into our parks, but also how to do it well rather than just do it randomly, to have some kind of method and purpose to it so that we can focus on the things that perhaps might be the priorities and working out what they are and what might work. So what to focus on, and also some resources. I won't have time to go into detail of everything, but I will point you to some resources where you can go and explore areas that might interest you and might be more relevant to your particular case. And also how to just really get your baseline, where to begin, because if you don't know what you've got, then how do you know you're improving it? So we'll look at that a little bit. And there'll be some opportunities to ask questions, and I'm going to run a couple of polls just to get your opinions and your feedback on some things. And then at the end there'll be a chat room. So if we run out of time and you have questions, we'll go into the discussion room at the end, and we can explore more there. That'll be more sort of interactive. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, or attempt to. Here we go. Hopefully this is working now. Right, so I'm hoping that you can all see what I can see. Okay, excellent. Right, so here we are. We'll begin. Now, this is just a little thought to get us going. So I thought I'd share this with you. If a city were a wild creature, I think its heart would be its people. The fresh flowing rivers and the flower-lined paths would be its veins. And its immune system and the lungs would be in the parks and the other green spaces. These would be its natural health system. And where nature breathes and thrives, we do too. Now, this matters because so many of us are urban. More than 80% of us live in towns and cities in the UK. It's where we get our daily dose of nature, most of us. So what happens in our local green spaces matters for us, for our contact with nature. It's good for our health and well-being, and it's also excellent for wildlife, because a lot of wildlife now is doing better in the cities than it's doing in the traditional countryside, and I'll give some examples in this talk of that, so that we can actually make a really big difference to wildlife in our cities if we think carefully about how we manage and look after our parks and green spaces and golf courses and school grounds and so on, allotments and what have you. So we've actually got 62,000 parks and green spaces. It's a big area, but about 2/3 of that is amenity grassland and close mown, according to some research that's been done. Quite a lot of it might have chemicals on it. That might range from nutrient enrichment with things like nitrogen to other sorts of pesticides. By contrast, we've lost about 97% of our flower-rich grasslands since the 1930s. So if you consider that we've got 62,000 parks and green spaces and all those hectares, that could be making up some of that lost green area. It may not be as nature rich, but it's still significant, especially given that nature is in crisis. So this is a really, really great opportunity to address the ecological emergency in places where we live. Now, this is an article I wrote for BBC Wildlife magazine back in August. I'm afraid it's print only, but it was a bit of a call to arms because of what I'd seen happening with the Greta Thunberg march and everyone being up in arms about the turf being trampled allegedly and destroyed. It wasn't destroyed, but anyway, it created a wonderful opportunity to crowdfund to make green spaces better, focusing on College Green. But what I found curious about this was the people who were cross about the park grass being trampled didn't seem to be aware that the grass was in fact itself the destruction of nature. What we do when we close mow areas is we destroy lots of opportunities, but you know, if we manage areas differently, we really can bring nature back into cities, even in a really tough space like College Green. So today then, let's see what we should focus on. We're going to look at the wildlife habitats and the species in them and decisions, what's there already and why we need to know that. How we can make it better and some of the pitfalls and some nice examples, and also look at what's hidden, because we can't protect what we can't identify and what we can't find. So we might think we're doing well, but if we're not looking really closely and we're not understanding our baseline, then how do we know we're doing the right thing? So I'm going to look at exploring what's there already and how we do that. And the two methods that ecologists use often, naturalists go out and record, but ecologists tend to like to measure things. So they'll do a desk study and they might do a field visit and look at different ways of assessing the nature that's there already and the best way to improve it and the potential to improve it. So I'll offer you some resources on that. I mean, here, for example, we've got the jay. Many of you will recognise the jay, and that's a common species found in Bristol and Bath's parks. Lovely bird. Perhaps less people will know the one in the middle, and that's the slow worm, and that's declined massively at a national level. It's a really cryptic species. It tends to come out at dusk and dawn. It tends to hide in the grass and hide in under things. So people don't necessarily know about it. You probably do know it if you have an allotment in Bristol, because there's lots of them doing really well on allotments, but they don't do so well on short grass and areas that are heavily mown. And so that's an example of an animal that we may overlook that could be actually doing better in our green spaces if we manage things well. The one on the bottom right, that's the lesser horseshoe bat, and that's another example of a species that actually populates several of our parks and green spaces around Bristol and Bath. People probably don't know it's there. You've got to have a bat detector, you've got to go out at the right time. Even with a bat detector, they're really quiet animals. They echolocate at a very high frequency, and it's very easy to miss that echolocation call unless you're pointing your bat detector in the right direction at the right time. But we know they're there. So what's useful is to understand these hidden animals and how we can make our parks better for the ones that are there and need the support, and then what else we can look at in the landscape around that we could bring back into our park, like the lesser horseshoe bat, for example. So I would suggest that we start with a desk study and we get the baseline. Find existing records, find ecology reports, historical ones that have already been done. Now, I know that parks budgets have been cut nationally, and lots of parks don't even have a management plan anymore because of that, but there will be historical records that will tell you what's either on your site or near your site that you could bring back. So then you need to think about, if things were there, they might still be there, but they might have gone. If they have gone, then why, and what is it that's gone wrong? What is it? Is it something you can fix and bring back? And look at the surrounding area as well. Is it that they can't get to your park anymore because there's no connection across the landscape? And if we actually make several of our parks better, are we actually creating those stepping stones again for that nature to move back into your park from next door? Then look at the present, look at the site use and the conflicts within it. What shortfalls are there with the management and the budgets? And you may have very differing opinions in your local community about how you manage that space. You may find that you want to leave the grass long, but local people don't want to because they want the grass to be short so they can play football on it, for example. So we have to share our spaces with lots of different users who have lots of different desires, and they won't all want the same thing. And we have to compromise sometimes in what we want to achieve and get people to understand why it matters and negotiate why it matters so much that they have to perhaps rethink what their values were or what they thought to be the case, and consider other ways that they can support wildlife that is going to get local support, because without the local support you're not going to win. And then once you've got all that, you can think about your future potential and what's likely to work and work well. So first of all, I'd like to do a poll and ask among the people watching this, who actually does any wildlife recording already, and what level you are, whether you're beginner or intermediate, or whether you have specialist skills in any particular species groups that might actually be really useful and which you could share with your local parks group. So we'll have a minute to ask people, please, if you could just indicate where you are with that, please. Let's see if the poll's working. If you click over to polls in the chat box, hopefully. Is the poll working, Charlie?
Yes, there are 2 polls in the chat area now. So we've got one is, do you do any wildlife recording in your park, and indicate whether you're a beginner, intermediate or advanced. I'm clicking beginner. And so far we've got 55% of people would consider themselves beginners. We've got 27.8% intermediate and 15% advanced. Please do keep those answers coming in. And then for the question of what wildlife expertise do you have in your group? I should have included one that says none, because that would be helpful. But it's looking like the majority have some plant expertise. Butterflies is also popular, and birds. Not so much on moths or bats or amphibians, but we'll keep an eye on those as they develop. So yeah, it looks like the majority of people here today are beginners, but we do have a couple of experts in the room.
Excellent, thank you. So, I mean, that just shows that that we already have a really good range of skills that we can share among our group, but also that it does illustrate that there's groups that we're going to overlook, and that's just because not everyone can be an expert at everything, and people have their own particular interests. You know, I'm a complete botany nerd. I also work a lot with bats. I've done all sorts of other species work as well, but we all have our own biases, and so it's likely that you have particular skills that might be the focus that you go with, because that's the area that you have some expertise and some interest. But it might be when you explore things a bit more that you think, well, actually, although I'm really quite into my plants, I didn't realise that we've got a really rare bat here, for example, and maybe we should try and focus on that, even though we don't necessarily know much about it. And maybe we can get some help and resources with that so that we can improve our skills in that area. Is everyone seeing my screen again? I'm hoping that you can all see my screen. I'll carry on talking. Right, so we've done our poll. So where to find those records? This is the NBN Atlas. This is the National Biodiversity Network website. It's a really good resource for you to tap into. This is crowdsourced wildlife records from naturalists and volunteers and recording groups all around the UK, going out and recording what nature they find. And they've been doing that for several decades now. And we have a phenomenal historical record of the wildlife in Britain, thanks to all these volunteers, 197 million records specifically. Now you can go on their website, and I haven't got time to do it today, but you can go on there and you can tap in any location or any species, and it will map it for you, and it will tell you the frequency and occurrences and when they were, and from that you can get an idea. It's not necessarily 100% accurate because it's based on what people have looked for. There will be an absence of records for groups that are less recorded, for example spiders, but there will be a really good illustration there of what you have locally or what you have nearby that you can bring back into your park. So have a look, have an explore on there, and it will help inform you about about what you could have locally and what you might be able to improve. This is another way to find out what you have locally that's a priority. Now, biodiversity action plans are things that councils do. This is an example, bottom left is the Bristol Biodiversity Action Plan. You can look these up on the internet, they're freely available. And it gives you an overview of what the priorities are thought to be in your area, whether it's Bristol, Bath or South Gloucestershire. These are the 3 examples I've given. So Bristol, we've got the Bristol onion in the gorge, we've got the peregrine falcon, I think that's a white beam tree because we've got endemic ones in Bristol, and the hedgehog, which It's doing much better in cities now than the countryside, according to some research. So that's a priority species that we can help in our parks. And we've got hedgehogs in my park in South Bristol, and I see them quite regularly, which is lovely. And that's a really, really lovely species that you can help in your park if you manage it in a way that's good for them. South Gloss, we've got 150 priority species. Go and have a look if you're from that area and consider, you know, is the skylark something you could help in your green space? Maybe, maybe not, but have a look at which ones might be really crying out for support right now that you could help, and maybe focus on those. Bath, all of the British bat species are a priority in Bath, so that's something that you could maybe connect with your local bat group or the Bat Conservation Trust and find out how you can bring in good habitat and roosting opportunities for those bats, and also think about light pollution. That's a really big one with bats. And there's a list there of other species that are priorities in Bath. So have a look at those for your local area and see if that gives you some inspiration. Here's an example of one I did in Bristol. So you can go onto the NBN gateway and type in small blue butterfly, and this is a map of the Bristol region. That big green square is a satellite map of Bristol city area, and those red squares are the records for where the small blue butterfly occurs. On the bottom right, you can see a map of the UK, and those red dots tell you what we've got left of the small blue butterfly in the UK. And as you can see, it's looking pretty sparse. It's declined something like nearly 50% in the last few decades. And it's a priority species. It requires just one food plant for its caterpillar, which is the kidney vetch, which is this yellow flower on the bottom left. You need that one plant to bring that butterfly back into your park. Now in the middle, you can see a yellow circle. That's my local park. That's Victoria Park in Bristol. And I found a small blue butterfly in my park. And I took a photo and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I mean, they're about the size of my fingernail. They're tiny little butterflies. And it had come in to a flower bed that me and the volunteers had created. We set up some sort of mini meadow areas in Victoria Park over a few years. And all of a sudden I found this lovely small blue butterfly. And I couldn't believe it. And I thought, well, what's this doing in my park? We don't have small blue butterflies. They're rare. So I went online and I had a look, and lo and behold, there were some small blue butterflies in Bristol in these other areas, but not in the middle. So what was it doing in my park? Had I restored a habitat for the small blue butterfly? So we looked into it. Lots of naturalists sort of went, oh no, you didn't find the small blue butterfly. It's impossible. Well, I had photos to prove it. So, well, how is it there? And this is really great news, an example of how you can bring in a wildflower patch and you can bring back potentially a declining species. What we think has happened is that the butterfly overwinters as a caterpillar and as a larva on the kidney vetch, and we brought in plug plants of kidney vetch into our park, and we think it came in overwintered probably as a larva. However, they can fly over 1 kilometre. So there's a potential here, and this shows, if you look at those red squares and you look at that yellow circle in the middle, we can connect. This is a way to make stepping stones for a butterfly so it can reconnect with isolated populations and recover across the city. So that's a really nice example of the outcome that you can achieve if you just do one thing. This is Bristol Regional Environmental Record Centre in Bristol, and these keep all the records for local wildlife in the Bristol and Bath region. You can go on their website. You can actually, I think you have to pay for it, but you can request a full species list for your site. Ecologists pay for these. I don't know if they're free for volunteers and community groups. You'd have to find out, but it's a really useful resource for looking at what you have in your area. And they also publish lots of local atlases, such as the flora of the Bristol region, the butterflies and the moths. Really useful, really interesting books if you're trying to get to grips with what's in your area and what's important and what's nearby and what you could bring back from the surrounding landscape. So have a look on that link if you'd like more of that. This is the area covered by BERC. That's that map shows you the regions that they cover. So if you live in that area, that's your local environmental record centre. But there are others for other parts of the UK. You can look them up. Another really useful resource for you is iSpot. Now this is a sort of online crowdsourcing wildlife record sort of website, and this here is a map of the BS3 postcode area in South Bristol, where I set up an iSpot project a few years ago. And the aim of it was to find out what wildlife we have in South Bristol and to share records and to give the general public an idea about how to identify what they have, because quite often you might not necessarily have the skills, but you might be out with your phone and you might take a photograph of something and you can't ID it, and you don't know if it's important locally or rare or just very exciting, or you just want to know what it is. So if you go on there and share your photo, you will find lovely volunteers, and a lot of them are experts, will identify your species for you. And how do you know they're correct? Well, most of the people on there have a score assigned to them on their expertise level, and you'll very quickly get, you know, quite reliable experts coming in and telling you which moth or butterfly or ant or spider or whatever it is you found. So that's a really good way of getting a free and easy and quick way of getting identification for what you found locally in your park. And this is, you can create your own map zone. You can create this for your park or your allotment or whatever, and it will be populated by all the local records, not just your ones, but everybody's. So if you're taking part in a wildlife recording event, you can find all the records on there for that, and that's really useful. Another really useful site is the online atlas of the British and Irish flora. It's a brilliant website if you're into botany and wildflowers. It lists all of our thousands of flowering plants and mosses and ferns and liverworts in the UK and where they are, and it maps them as an interactive map there. So if you think you found something and you're not really sure, if you punch it into that website, it will show you the map of where that species is, and that can be quite helpful if you're trying to work out whether you've found something and you've identified it correctly or not. It's got other tools on the website as well, such as, let me show you this. So hang on. So this is great pignut, and it's a plant that loves limestone soil. And so it can be an indicator species. An indicator species is really useful if you're on your site and you don't really know what kind of geology or ecology or sort of environmental factors are influencing the nature on your site. And sometimes that can be invisible if the site's been blitzed with turf and has been managed so heavily for decades, and you can't even see what the nature was anymore or what the local plant community might have been. If you look at some of the things that are growing in the crevices around the edges, and you find something like great pignut, then you know you're on that type of soil, because it has very particular requirements on light and moisture and pH level and drainage and so on. So you can use this website to find out about the plants on your site and what they tell you, what that means, what that tells you about your land. And once you know that, you can work with that to choose what to plant and what to bring in. And obviously what's going to work well is what's going to work well with the soil and the geology and the hydrology. Some more examples here of ecological indicator species. So the one on the left is woodland anemone. That's an ancient woodland indicator species. Most of you probably won't be working on woodlands, but if you've got a cemetery, for example, you might find that there, and it's a good indication that you've got a really, really healthy flora and that it's not been disturbed too much. Meadowsweet in the middle there is an indicator of wet and poorly draining ground. It's not actually got any nectar in it, but it's really, really good for quite a good range of moths and dragonflies and hoverflies and all sorts of other insects. So it's a really valuable plant for nature, and a really nice one to bring in, even though it doesn't have any nectar. And then other examples such as the alder and the willow tree are also indicators of wet soil, and they would be good ones to plant if you've got boggy ground. So ecological indicators really help us to read the landscape, past and present, and when we're looking for wildlife, and we really do want to look for the wildlife value and consider those environmental factors so that what we bring back has a chance of working and working well. So when you're thinking about that, also think about, does your site offer food and water and shelter, safety? I'm thinking about things like drains that frogs fall down and traffic accidents when toads are trying to get to their ponds. Also, light pollution is a hazard for some species. Are there good opportunities for the species to reproduce and connect with surrounding populations and disperse? Does it have space to thrive, and how can you improve that? And what stresses and problems are there in trying to address all of that? So now we're going to look at field methods for understanding your site and getting out there in fun ways. So I really recommend that you join local naturalist groups, for example, Bristol or Bath Naturalist Society, Bristol Nature Network, your Botanical Society of the British Isles, or the RSPB. Just really good examples of how you can really improve your skills and knowledge and ideas about how to improve your site. There are more than 80 different recording societies and schemes in the UK that you can tap into, and some of them will be local to you and be able to help you to understand the more hidden and obscure and cryptic species, such as solitary bees. Not so many people will know about those, but they're really, really important, and city sites are really important for supporting them if we manage our land in the right way. So have a look on the Biological Records Centre website and iRecord, which is the app they use to record with, and you'll find maps and apps and data on there that you can tap into, and that's a really, really useful knowledge resource that will help you. You could also consider running a BioBlitz so that you can improve your knowledge of the site. And I ran a big one in Victoria Park a few years ago, and I've kept the resources for that on my website. You can have a look on there. I'll give you the link in a second. That's sort of might offer you some ideas about how to run a BioBlitz and ways to engage people with it, not just from a recording point of view, but also from a sort of arts and storytelling point of view as well. There's going to be, have a look on the Bristol Natural History Consortium website as well for BioBlitzes. They host them and offer resources. They're also running something called the City Nature Challenge in April. They're going to tell you about that later today, but that's another way that you can connect with other people and nature in your park and learn more about it. That's my website link if anyone wants to have a look and find out ideas and ways and methods to survey your local wildlife in your park and understand what's there. That photo is me setting out some hedgehog tunnels. We did that with a local school, and we got quite a lot of nice hedgehog footprints, inky footprints in the hedgehog tunnels. It's a good fun thing to do with people of any age, but children love it as well. And you need to know where your hedgehogs are. I mean, they roam over a wide area, but if you've got them in your park, you know they're there, that's fantastic. And then you can think about how to make the site better for them. Some more examples here of recording schemes. The BSBI run a New Year plant hunt over New Year's period to look at flowering plants on New Year's Day, and it's the sort of thing that people don't realise happens, but once you go out looking, you realise there's more to the nature in your park than you realise. I think we recorded about 30 or 40 flowering plants in Victoria Park over New Year period, and nobody had looked before, and that's a really important resource for pollinators in the winter. Was the Bee, Wasp and Ant Recording Society is another really good one, and there's a whole list of them on here. But if you go on the Biological Record Centre website, it has a whole list of all of these societies and how you can get involved with them. On the bottom right, there is a bat detector. You can pick one of those up for probably 50 or 60 quid, a really cheap one, or you can get a really flash expensive one for sort of £300-400 upwards, so that you can actually hear the bats echolocating in your park. And there's a local bat group you could link with to that as well. The Big Butterfly Count is another really good one you could do. That's in July and August every year. It's a great fun one to do in parks. See what butterflies and moths you have flying in the daytime, and have a look. It will make you really look at what plants you have and what nectar provision you have in your park, because if you've got something like thistles, for example, it'll just be covered in the butterflies, and you'll be able to really recognise the value of one plant. Nettle's another one, stinging nettle, just crawling with wonderful peacock butterflies, caterpillars. Just one little thing like that can make a massive difference, and it's great to see it when you go out looking. I'd encourage you to run a moth night so you can really understand what's going on in your park at night. This is one we ran in Victoria Park as part of our BioBlitz, and we found, I can't remember the exact number now, I think it was about 60 or 70 different flying moths in our park right in the middle of Bristol, and we were really impressed by that and thought, okay, well, these moths all have really particular food plants that they need, so what can we do to try and increase the food plants for these particular moths so that they thrive? Okay, so I'm going to stop there for a second and see if anyone's got any questions. If they have, type them in the chat box. But we'll do most
Brilliant.
questions.
So we've got one on that Francis and Susan have been batting around. I think they want to know what cryptic species are.
Right, okay, so cryptic ones are the ones that we don't see so often. They're a little bit secretive. So slow worms, for example, burrow under the soil. Bats tend to cling to the shadows in the trees and hedgerows, so you don't see them. Various species that we just generally don't see very much unless we really know how to go out looking for them is what we mean by cryptic species.
Thank you. Another question is, would you recommend a particular app to use? There's 3 available. Do you have any recommendations?
Well, there are quite a few, and I think it's horses for courses really, and I quite like iSpot, but other people like iRecord because they can that data gets shared with conservation groups and used for other purposes. It depends really what you want the data to be used for. If it's just so that you can take a photograph and get an identification for your own learning, then iSpot is brilliant, and there are various other ones. I'm not going to single out any one because people will go, oh, that was rubbish. But there's one you can do with plants now called Leaf Snap, for example, and that's great as a beginner, but it doesn't necessarily work for every single species. There can be errors. You take a photograph of a plant and it tells you from the leaf what it thinks it is, and that's good for general common plants, but doesn't always work for everything, for example. Yeah, I mean, there isn't really a short way of becoming an expert at anything, you know, you have to put in the hours, but they're really good starting place for getting going on recording the apps. But iRecord is good. I think that the City Nature Challenge use iNaturalist, and that's because it's an international project, and I think it was set up in America, and the American system uses iNaturalist, so similar principle, works in sort of the same way, but if you're working with a particular scheme, you'll have to use their app so that your data is shared in their way.
Brilliant. And we've got one other question from Susan. When not to plant anything, for example, if your land and not a random use of packet seed on somebody else's land, as in when it's not appropriate to plant anything.
Yeah, I'm going to come on to that in the next bit because yeah, there's sometimes there's a right and a wrong, and there are controversies around that. So we'll do that in the next bit.
Lovely.
So we move on to the next bit so we don't run out of time.
Yeah, I think so. Just a time check for you. You're at 10:52, and we've got the next case study at 11:15. So
okay. So here's some real basics. I'm going to speed up now. Here's some real basics, how you can make nature better in your park. More native trees and a mix of different species. More linked hedgerows as corridors, and these are things that others are talking about later today. Bring in more wildflower areas using native species, and make sure you think about year-round natives, not just a flower show for summer. Add a pond. You will increase the wildlife in your park by an order of magnitude if you stick a pond in, and there's Frog Life are talking about this later today. Offer deadwood zones, so lots of saprophytic species that rely on deadwood and rotting things really need that habitat, so don't clear away all the dead stuff, leave it there and make piles and leave standing deadwood and lying deadwood. Mow less often. Try and reduce the amount of grass mowing you do, and don't do it during the growing season. Have a look on the Bug Life and the Plant Life websites for resources on the best times to mow and the best times to not mow, essentially. And think about how you manage your grassland, because mowing less and bringing back more wildflowers into your grass takes a different management approach, and that's something you may not have control over, but it's something you can work with the council on, and someone from the council is here later today to talk about. that sort of thing, you can ask them questions. Now, here are some pitfalls. We must avoid creating harm in our enthusiasm to bring nature back. Tree planting in the wrong place, introducing cornfield annuals, which are short-lived, and they're not really nature. They look wonderful, they look beautiful, and they are good for pollinators. But really, what we're doing when we create a patch of cornfield annuals, such as poppies and cornflower and so on, is we're just doing ornamental gardening with wildflowers, and that's great. But it isn't a wildflower meadow, and it works. It serves as a temporary, colourful, nectar-rich resource while you plant perennials, which take longer to establish and will take 2 or 3 years to get going. So think about it, but make sure you don't just plant those. Try and put perennial seeds in as well. And really, a lot of people would say, well, why don't we just work with plants we've already got? Why do we need to bring in seeds? And it's a very valid point, because you want really to bring the nature back that was on your site. You want local provenance, seeds that were there historically, that are your natural heritage for your site. But the problem is a lot of it's disappeared because of decades of intensive management and oversowing with ryegrass and other species that are so competitive and aggressive that all the lovely wildflowers just get excluded, and the seed bank has gone. So you will have to bring stuff in probably on a lot of sites if you don't have stuff there naturally. Try and avoid the exotic flower beds and hanging baskets, and try and pick natives as much as you can, because they don't just have the nectar and the pollen, they also have the food plants for the larval stages for caterpillars and so on, and that's really essential, and they support much more wildlife than most exotics do. Rethink what you consider to be weeding. When you think, if we're not replacing an eyesore with something better when we put in tidy plants, let things go a bit wild and be proud of it. And just try and get rid of those short lawns and chemical treatments. Think carefully about scrub bashing, because people like to do this, and they do it on sites where you have a priority other species that will suffer if you let the scrub take over. But scrub is actually really, really important for quite a lot of wildlife. So try not to be too prejudiced against having some bramble and nettles and so on your site. They're really, really good for wildlife, unless you have a site where they're encroaching on important grassland with rare species that should be the priority. Okay. You can go online and have a look at tree planting in the wrong place if you want. I wrote something on this for The Independent. I haven't got time to go into it today, but sticking in trees on sites where you could just put acorns and seeds and let nature restore itself through rewilding can cause horrific damage here. Some of these sites where where there's been tree planting going on over grasslands that have really important wild species on them are going to get wiped out by sticking in tree planting, which might help address climate change, but it's not going to help improve biodiversity. It's probably going to eliminate wildlife. So think carefully on that. I mean, the jay is your classic bird that will bring back oaks. That's your tree planting right there. So consider that carefully when you think about planting on grass, and just probably don't do it unless you really don't have any wildlife and any other choices. And if you're dealing with a bit of tarmac and you're trying to bring wildlife back, then maybe yeah. This is so important on brownfield sites. So this is Troopers Hill in Bristol, which is a really, really important site for lots of rare species. It's an old industrial site. It's really toxic. It's got all sorts of pollutants there, which wildlife loves. And so we have to think, what have I got? What am I destroying if I improve, in inverted commas, this site? Quite often you really need to understand your site and what's there, and maybe some of the things that might look a bit odd or industrial wasteland or a mess are actually the things that the wildlife loves and we need to keep. So make sure you understand that before you think about transforming. Heather, for example, on Troopers Hill, let me show you this. This is how many species are supported by heather. That's what you're getting, and you might not want the scrub to encroach and destroy the heather, because these are all the species that you're getting from that one plant. Think about, if you're on acid soil, think about introducing heather on your site. Don't do away with weeds. I wrote on The Guardian for this, people going around chalking all the weeds on their paths. These weeds, as we call them, have really, really high value for wildlife in their nectar and their pollen, and there's food plants for caterpillars and beetles and all sorts of other things. So we want those weeds. Let's not destroy them. Oh, have a look on the More Than Weeds website for resources on how to identify urban weeds, as we call them, our native wildflowers, as I call them. Ragwort's a classic example of something that people try and destroy, and it's fantastic for wildlife. You can see there the cinnabar moth caterpillar is completely reliant on this plant, but there's over 100 different invertebrates that rely on that one plant, this one native plant. So don't pull out the ragwort unless you've got horses on your land, which you won't have if you're dealing with a park or allotment. And then think about ragwort as a good thing. The same with dandelion and the same with bramble. These species are just towering empires of wildlife, and we want them on our green spaces. There's some peacock caterpillar butterflies on a nettle. You've got teas on the right there, fantastic winter seeds for lots of urban wildlife such as birds. And sow thistle, one of the best for wildlife, but it's just a little weed that grows in the back alleys and everywhere. And people think, oh, we need to spray that off. Well, no, you don't actually. Having that is much better than having an ornamental flower bed in the corner of your school grounds or whatever. Ivy is another one. Don't rip out the ivy, leave it in. It's a great source of food in the winter for lots and lots of wildlife. Here's an example. I'm going to just speed through these. This is what we did in Victoria Park. We did put in cornfield annuals, but then we also seeded with perennials. So we've had loads of people involved in this. We've created these lovely wildflower beds. They're sort of 30 metre by 3 metre wide beds. We've done about a dozen of them now. Really wonderful. We've got the schools and lots of groups involved. Increased all the wildlife around Victoria Park. Brought loads of stuff back, and it looked beautiful. These are some examples of the flowers and the moths and butterflies that we've got. So these are some of the range of species that you can introduce into your park, not just with nectar, but with the actual food plants. We need to think wider than just nectar, and they are pollinator lifelines, but we do actually need to think about the whole plant and the whole life cycle of the insect and what we're supporting. So, for example, think about having plants that have short-tongued that can be a food source for short-tongued bees, medium-tongued insects, and long-tongued ones, because then you will have more diversity. So we've got here, I think that's fennel on the left. We've got catsia, which is in the dandelion family, in the middle there, and then we've got a buddleia on the right-hand side, which is actually an alien plant, which is a bit of a nuisance plant, but it's still wonderful for quite a lot of the butterflies and moths. That on the right there is the tongue of a bee. And on the bottom, you can see different examples of bees with different length tongues, and how if you introduce all these different wildflowers, you will support a different range of bees. Here's an example of a wild carrot, which is a landing platform for lots of different tiny little insects, and it's also the mating platform for soldier beetles. So it's not just about the nectar, it's also about providing somewhere to live and reproduce. A more specialist here, so that's the horseshoe vetch, which is really important for the Chalk Hill blue butterfly over in Bath. And then we've got birdfoot trefoil in the middle there, which is probably supporting more insects than any other single wildflower that I've found anyway. That's one to think about on your site. And then wild carrots. If you have wild carrot, you could support the carrot mining bee, which is nearly disappearing altogether in the Bristol and Bath region. It's just hanging on the edges there, and all it needs is this one plant to not be weeded out and for it to recover. Beelines. Have a look at the Bug Life website for beelines and how you can connect up habitats across the Bristol and Bath region by creating these stepping stones that we talked about. And also there's resources on the Bug Life website for how to do it better. Go on there and have a look, because we haven't got time to deal with all of that today. Have a look on the wildseed.co.uk website for ideas about which plants for your site would be good. Some of the, if you look on there, you will find most wildflowers on that site are listed under categories. So whether you have alkaline or acid soil or whatever, wet or dry soil, and really think about getting the right mix. If you have to bring in the seed mix, get the right mix for your soil type. That's a brilliant site for looking that up and understanding it better. Here's another example we did, and if you look carefully at the picture on the right, you'll see a wildflower bed, and then you'll see loads of long grass around it. And in the background, you can see the bright green grass, which is the amenity short grass, and really low diversity. And what we did is we just stopped mowing. And what we found was we brought crickets and grasshoppers back into Victoria Park. We had bats foraging and flying and hunting over the ground. We had tawny owls coming back and feeding on the voles that were now feeding on the grasshoppers that were now living in the long grass. Just that one change, when not mowing the grass so often, we brought back a whole ecosystem that was missing. Just really simple things. I've possibly run out of time, but we could continue this in the chat room afterwards if people would like to continue.
Alex, you've got about 10 more minutes if you want to continue for 10 minutes, and then any further questions we can do in the chat area. Continue the conversation.
Brilliant. All right. So there will be someone talking about trees and hedgerows later. I think of them as nature's cathedrals, because they really are absolute cathedrals of wonder and, yeah, almost worship, actually, if you're if you're a naturalist and you're into discovering incredible wildlife. Just one oak tree, for example, does all this, hundreds of species, food. It's a windbreak, it's wood, it's paper, it's oxygen, it's a carbon sink. It gives us well-being, it's wildlife habitat, it's nutrient recycling, it reduces floods and noise and air pollution, it's shelter and shade, it protects the soil. I've repeated myself in my enthusiasm in writing this. It gives us opportunities for science and education, and it gives us beauty and joy and poetry and art and inspiration. It's all of those things. So who could not want more oak trees, or any other trees for that matter, in their park if they can find a space for them? And here's an example of the amount of wildlife that one tree can bring in, and why we need a variety. So if you've got this table that I made, which I took from a variety of science sources, and I compiled this to look at how many different insects are supported by one species of tree. I mean, the oak and the willow and the birch are colossal. You may not have space for an oak, and a willow might be troublesome depending on your site, but a birch tree, or even just a hedge of some of these species is bringing in a huge variety of wildlife back into your park that wasn't there. And yes, there's a maintenance issue if it's a hedgerow, and with trees as well, which is a problem because we don't have very much by way of council budget to pay for that. But we need to find the resources somehow. If we want to bring nature back into cities, we need to find a way of funding the management so that we can enable these trees and hedgerows and so on to come back. So just by the way, most of these species listed here are wind pollinated ones. They don't even offer nectar, okay, but they still support all of this. So we have to think beyond just, we need to bring in flowers, pollinators and nectar, because it's much wider than that. These are food plants and species for all the stuff that lives in the soil as well, all the beetles and saprophytic stuff that's living on the tree, and all the bats and the birds that feed on it on top of all this. So here's one of my favourite plants. This is blackthorn, the sloe. It's the earliest one to flower in the year. It provides food for 250 different invertebrate species. I mean, how can you beat that? And why haven't you got blackthorn on your site? If you haven't got blackthorn on your site, bring blackthorn back onto your site. It's just an absolute joy. And of course, we get the sloe gin as well. Birch, get some birch on your land. So birch family, top right hand picture there is a thing that people used to make out of birch leaves. It's lovely it's a really old illustration from I think a couple of 100 years ago, but I love it. The different uses of birch are extraordinary. But silver birch tree supports loads of birds, chaffinches, tree pipits, willows, willow warblers, nightingales, robins, finches, the whole list there, and 500 different species of insects as well, 106 beetles, 105 moths and butterflies. This is a phenomenal amount of wildlife you can bring in just by bringing bringing in the native birch tree. It's fast growing, it's shallow rooted, so it's not going to undermine your foundations. It doesn't cast deep shade, so you can still have plants growing under it on your allotment or whatever, but just bring in birch and watch wildlife come back. Hazel's another fantastic one. It's again wind pollinated, but it's actually really good in the early season for bees. So bumblebees coming out of hibernation will go and find the pollen on hazel, and it's really important for that reason, because there's not much other food around in December and January for our wildlife. So it's a nice out of season flower. And obviously, of course, you get the hazelnuts as well, which other wildlife loves. And heather is another great one for the winter. So you'll have queen bumblebees emerging early in the spring after hibernating, and they will be looking for quick sugar and pollen so that they can build their burrows and reproduce. And so if you've got an opportunity to bring in heather on your site, you'll need special soil for that. It's worth thinking about doing for the winter, that wildlife value. We talked about ivy already, didn't we? So we'll skip this one. Another reason we need to think diversity is because we've got lots of diseases, and we've also got climate change coming in now and having an effect on our native trees. So you want to have resilience, and the way to do that is to increase the diversity of trees on your site. But of course, you've got to be careful that you don't bring in those diseases if you're bringing in those trees. Ash dieback is an example of a fungus that's been brought in by transferring trees and the horticultural trade, moving things around from nurseries and so on, can spread risk. That's another reason why we don't always want tree planting. If we can just plant an ash seed, we'll get ourselves a tree. They don't need looking after. An ash tree will just grow like a weed if you put the seed in the ground. And we've got here 1,000 different species associated with ash, and that's phenomenal. So what are we going to do if all the ash trees die? And what are those 1,000 species going to live on instead? There isn't one single tree that can replicate the ash, but if we have a diversity of different trees, we can try and create some kind of insurance policy for all those species that are going to be impacted if we lose the ash tree. So think about that as well. I haven't got time to do this one, but we'll talk about trees are not being equal in the chat. You can actually do more harm than good if you plant the wrong tree in a city's place. Dead wood is dead good. So think about dead trees and dead logs, and that's just some examples there of the kind of wildlife that you're going to be supporting with all these different niches and habitats and micro habitats. And deadwood's great for nocturnal and hidden wildlife as well. So here's an example. I'm quite into my bats. We've got 18 species resident in the UK. They're all protected. Lots of them live in cities. And here are the different places on a tree that will help a bat. You know, they're using the bark, they're using rot holes, they're roosting, they're feeding on the insects, they're hibernating in the trees, they're resting and feeding and perching, all because there's one old tree there, especially the mature trees. Have a look on the Bat Conservation Trust website for how you can bring more bats back to your green space. In terms of parks, one of the big things to think about is light pollution. There are several species such as the long-eared bat, which I think we've got here. Yeah, the long-eared bat, which really is very, very light shy. They really need dark corridors. So if you've got lighting in your park, can you change the lighting and make it more bat friendly lighting? Yes, you can. There are different ways you can light a park, and they're not all as bad as each other. So it's the timing of the lighting and the type of lighting and where you position it and so on, things like that. And they don't just need light pollution, they also need a really good habitat. So long grass to hunt over, water so that they can feed, and planting things such as night flowering plants that attract the moths that the bats feed on, and creating roosts for them as well. You can actually put in they're quite cheap to get. You can get bat boxes. I'll show you a picture in a minute. You can put those in your park, and that's a really good way of helping bats. Here's some examples of some lovely wildlife pond plants. We've got purple loosestrife, cuckoo flower, water mint. They're really great for the moths and the flies and the mosquitoes that in turn the bats love to eat. So when you bring in that plant and support those insects and those flies, you're also supporting bats. Here's some examples of night flowering plants that are good for bats because of the moths. And here are two examples of bat boxes. So on the left is a woodland one that's much more sturdy and it's made of concrete. So you'll get crevice dwellers and you'll get roost hole dwellers and large cavity dwelling bats, but depending on what space you've got, different roost opportunities will be used by different bats. But again, have a look on the Bat Conservation Trust website. The one on the picture on the right there is a really easy DIY thing you can make yourself, little slits that bats can go in and roost, and they'll use those at different times of the years for either mating or just roosting or hibernating. And the tawny owl is another one that's a fantastic city species. If you bring in tawny owl boxes into your park, you're doing some great good. We've got tawny owls in Victoria Park because we've got the long grass for them to hunt over. Wonderful to hear the tweet and the twoo of the two owls talking to each other at night. I often hear that from my window. And they will use nest holes, and they will use old squirrel drays, and they will use owl boxes. And they like old trees and parks with open spaces to hunt over next to old trees. So think about the whole landscape. How are you able to support an owl by changing how you manage your green space? And this is a really good fun thing you can do. If you do get owls, have a look at their owl pellets, because you can pick them apart. This is a project we did in Victoria Park. It was great fun. We got everyone looking at owl pellets and pulling them apart and finding all the skulls of the little voles and things that they'd eaten. And from that, you can understand what that owl is eating in your, it might not necessarily have hunted over your park, but it gives you an idea of what the local mammals and other animals are in your park that are feeding those owls. There's quite a good activity to do with children and people of all ages. And hedgehogs, someone's talking about, so I'm not going to go into that, but this is we'll just leave that there. And someone's talking about hedgehogs later. Someone's also talking about ponds later. Really do whatever you can to try and bring water back into your green space. It's so vital for wildlife. This yellow circle on this grid here shows you the examples of the different species of invertebrates that are supported by ponds. There's 398 different species listed there just by bringing ponds back into your space. So you won't get all of them, obviously, but that's where the biodiversity is. And that's just the stuff living in the pond. That's not even including the birds and the bats and the hedgehogs and the amphibians and reptiles and things that will be feeding on all of that. And some examples of things that you might bring back if you bring in a pond. And of course, now's a good time to go out and do the toad patrol. I think that's might still be happening. It's Bristol and Bath run toad patrols to try and help toads get back to their park ponds from surrounding areas and get across the road safely. So that's a nice thing you can be involved in your green space. And I think we're going to finish here. So here's another really lovely idea you can do. This is a willow tunnel, and we put one in our local park with help from the Good Gym and from local community groups, Duke of Edinburgh Project Children, and various other people got involved in this. It's really good fun. It's a 25-meter long tunnel made of different species of willow. It looks lovely. It's good fun as a forest school activity for children to do from the local schools, but also it supports wildlife. Lots and lots and lots of moths and other insects are using that willow, as well as the bumblebees and blue tits and other birds. So it's a really nice fun way of creating a wildlife habitat in your park that can actually be really good for people as well. I think this is the last slide. So poll 3, I'd just like to ask, is your group likely to try to do any of this in your green space? And there's a list here of different things that you could maybe think about doing. Just be interested to know how many of these things you might look at doing in your park now you've had some inspiration. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Alex. You ran massively over, but I think it would have been a tragedy. No, don't worry. We're still within time for the rest of the conference, but we're not going to have any time for questions for Alex now. And what I'm going to suggest is that if you're really keen to carry on the conversation with Alex, please do join the Continue the Conversation session that will go live from 10:30 to, sorry, we're at 11 o'clock now, aren't we? 11:30 to 11:45. And if you could let me know, I've just set up a quick poll. I would be good to get an idea of the numbers that are likely to join Alex for that, because I've got a feeling it might be more than the current capacity, in which case I'll change the setting of that session so that Alex can have more people there. Alex, if you could stop sharing your screen, that would be great. There's a little text box kind of just above your bottom navigation bar, and if you hit the button there, perfect. Brilliant. Well, I'm now delighted to welcome Becky Smith. So Becky is an active volunteer and member of the BS3 Wildlife Group. So we are supplementing all of our expert speakers' talks today with local examples of where volunteers are out there on the ground doing this stuff. So I'm really pleased that Becky has been able to join us. So I'm going to hand over to Becky, who's going to do a quick 10 minutes talking about how some of this stuff comes to life in BS3.
Yes, thanks, Charlie. I'm hoping everybody can hear me. Do let me know if there's any problems. And thank you for inviting us along to come and give a little case study on the BS3 Wildlife Group. Now, I must say, I've only been involved with the BS3 Wildlife Group for just over a year. So Ben Barker, who's the founding member, was unfortunately not able to come today. He was having some computer issues. So I've stepped in. Okay, so who is the BS3 Wildlife Group? We're made up of a range of volunteers from the local area who are all really passionate about wildlife and want to try and help protect wildlife as much as possible. The group launched the My Wild Bedminster project in 2017 and adopted similar objectives to those of the Avon Wildlife Trust's My Wild City project. Wider membership covers those who also follow the Facebook and Instagram social media sites, and those which receive the newsletter, and also those which provide information and data which feeds into our reports. It's estimated at the moment that the current membership is reaching approximately 1,000 people, which is brilliant, and that's so many people across our local area and potentially wider as well. One of our key aims of the BS3 Wildlife Group is to raise public awareness about the wildlife, initially in BS3, My Wild Bedminster, but we've also started to collaborate with the BS4, BS13 and BS14 postcodes, which sit under the My Wild South Bristol project, and even more recently with some of our contacts in North Bristol, which is brilliant. We want to create as many links as possible really across the whole of Bristol. We use that awareness to share and promote our second aim, which is to encourage people and organisations to improve local habitats. That could be a garden, a community patch, a park, a local nature reserve, an allotment, and any other green space really, to increase the number and range of native plants and wild animals within the BS3 or within Bristol area. And our slogan is "Every window box counts." So any type of planting that you can do to help wildlife in one little window box could be brilliant. So what do? We exchange ideas and questions and pictures throughout the year, mainly through the Facebook and Instagram pages, but also through the newsletter as well. We collect wildlife observations for local people, and we turn them into reports on local wildlife. So, for example, we've got annual reports on garden birds seen over the winter months from October to March, how many butterfly species live in BS3, a moth report in 2019, which was based on general observations, but we also had some moth trappers. There was a dragon report later in 2020, and there were smaller reports including hedgehog streets, birds of Ashton Court and starlings of BS3. We publish and promote nature trails. For example, there was the Malago Tree Trail, which was produced by a UWE Bristol student in 2020. And we also publish green space audits. So the group have audited larger green spaces and encouraged those supporting them to link up with others nearby and hopefully create a thriving archipelago of islands, green islands, linked by wildlife corridors, so rivers, railway lines, and domestic and community gardens. It's one of the main reasons why we want to establish links with other groups across Bristol so that we can try and connect up all the nature, all the wildlife in Bristol. And as I've said, the BS3, BS4, BS13, BS14 groups have all come together under the My Wild South Bristol project. In early 2020, the My Wild South Bristol project was awarded some funding by the Bristol Health Partners in recognition of the strong relationships between healthy environments and the well-being of human beings. This was a fund. It was to fund a series of meetings across South Bristol, as well as coach trips to go and visit the sites to see what was there and what others were doing. But unfortunately, the pandemic put a bit of a stop to that for the time being. But the BHP kindly agreed to roll over the money, so hopefully we'll be able to progress some of that later on in the year. And they also added a further £1,000 to help buy scientific equipment. So we've got some butterfly nets, some hedgehog tunnels, a bat detector, and a trail cam, which can be any of the members of the BS3 Wildlife Group can use. Ooh, I haven't finished that one yet. We also, where friends groups didn't exist, we've encouraged their formation. So one of the main ones that we've created in the last year is the Friends of Ashton Court Estate, or the FACE group. We realised that, Ashton Court is a huge area of a green space in Bristol, but there was no friends group supporting the whole of the estate and nature and site experiences when you went to visit. So we now have a constitution, and we have approximately between 40 and 50 members. I myself have become the secretary, so I attend all the Bristol Parks Forum meetings, and I send communications out to members. And we have initial plans to do some conservation work around the 14 ponds at the estate. We also aim to improve branding and hopefully create some nature trails and information boards up there a bit later on. Some of the members this year will have the opportunity to be involved in some surveying up there. So hopefully that will feed into the One City Ecological Emergency Strategy to provide a baseline for how wildlife is currently faring in those areas. I've picked myself to be involved in hedgehogs and surveying the skylarks up there. I'll explain hedgehogs in a minute, but particularly with the skylarks, we know that since the pandemic has hit, footfall in some of these areas has increased massively, and that's had a real impact on specifically the skylarks who are ground nesting birds. And the council have actually roped off some of the areas up there more recently to try and protect some of those sites. But we also want to do some surveying up there to see how well they're faring at the moment and whether their numbers have dramatically declined. And we've also have a logo now, actually, which a Bristol University student has kindly created for FACE. So I'll show you that in a minute. The BS3 Wildlife Group suggested in 2020 that 2021 could be potentially the year of the hedgehog. So we also suggested creating a BS3 hedgehog project. So myself, Clive Weston, who I think is here today, I think I've seen him pop up on the chat, and Sophie Clark all volunteered to come together and be administrators for the project. And since its creation, the project has recruited over 60 hedgehog champions, covering over 50 streets in BS3, with the aim of them leafleting their neighbours and talking to them about how they can open up their gardens if they're willing to, of course, by creating hedgehog highways and suitable habitats for hedgehogs. One of our champions, Kiara, very kindly designed a logo and a leaflet for us, which I'll show you in a minute, and we absolutely love it. It's brilliant. We also provide lots of information to through our Facebook group. We've got a Facebook group and an Instagram account for the BS3 Hedgehog Project, and we provide lots of information and resources on how you can help hedgehogs, building log piles, for example, to create a natural food source for them, but also how to support feed a hedgehog and what to do if you find a sick or injured hedgehog. But we're also encouraging local people to record their sightings through the National Hedgehog Street Map. But we also want to work with schools and after-school clubs and hopefully forest schools as well across Bristol this year to help raise some more awareness. So if anybody, I've seen some on the chat, that it's really important to engage young people within all of this nature work, really. So if anybody has any suggestions on how we can do that, that would be great. We have emailed schools, but we're aware at the moment they're probably very busy with all the children returning back after the lockdown. So we haven't had any engagement as yet, but hoping to hoping to increase that later on in the year. We're also collaborating with some other hedgehogs which have been set up as well around BS4, BS8 and BS16. And they're all really keen to use our resources and our logo, which we've created, and the leaflet. So that's really, really good. And the collaboration, I think, will just help open up much more of the right habitats for hedgehog across Bristol. So this is our leaflet, which you can see. I think it represents Bristol quite well with the colourful houses, and each of the hedgehog projects will have slightly different coloured houses to sort of match their postal code. And there's the logo for face as well. So my reflections since I joined the BS3 Wildlife Group, which was just over a year ago, although I did previously volunteer at the Avon Gorge and Downs Wildlife Project. I've always been really passionate about wildlife and nature, and I wanted to do more within my local area or across Bristol, really, to just try and help nature thrive a bit better, because we all know how it's so negative sometimes, the things that you hear on the news and how nature's declining and what we're doing to the land, really, in response to that. So I wanted to do something in my local area to really help. And it's given me so many opportunities to learn and to help raise awareness of nature, and also get involved in some of the conservation work around my local area. One of those examples is the Rangers Conservation Group at Ashton Court, which is run by the Bristol City Council. It's been brilliant to meet so many new people who all share this passion as well, including all the local residents who are involved in the BS3 group and the hedgehog group, but also Ella Hogg and Becky Belfin at the Bristol City Council Parks Department. And I think if there was one thing that could have helped me when I was starting all this out, if I'd known a little bit more about the various different departments within the council, but also the forums, the friends groups, and how they all work together, and how all the independent organisations as well work together to enhance nature in Bristol. So I've got one slide left, which is just the contacts. So if anybody wants to get in contact with any of us, just to ask us a question, or if they'd like to get involved or they have some advice, then that would be great. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Becky. That was a wonderful example of a really active and well-established group achieving great things, and the benefits of that and the idea behind it spreading across other postcodes. So really appreciate your time to talk us through that.
No worries, thank you.
So we are only running 1 minute behind, which I'm really feeling happy about. And Becky and Alex will be heading over to the Continue the Conversation session now. I've just popped the link for that in the chat box. It will be a chance for you to use your audio and your video as a more typical Zoom session, to be able to have a face-to-face conversation about what you've heard during this session. If you're not going to be joining that, we've got a 15-minute break, and we will be resuming back here on the stage at 11:45 with Stuart Paynton from Bristol Natural History Consortium, who's going to be talking about how the City Challenge could be a brilliant opportunity to put some of what we've heard from Alex and Becky today into practice. Thank you all so much, and thank you, Becky. See you at 11:45.